Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hispanic Serving Institution Identity Task Force, our town hall. We're glad that people were able to join today. We would have had this event in person, but we'll still get to cover a great amount of information and discussion virtually. So thank you for being here. My name is Luke Wood. I serve as our Chief Diversity Officer. And today is really the culmination of a year-long process designed to understand the DNA of our institution as it relates to how we serve our Latinx community, and really where we need to go to truly become a Hispanic serving institution. I'd really like to thank our chair of HSI Affairs, Roberto Hernandez, for hosting this important conversation, and for the numerous committee members and subcommittee members who invested their time in this critical task force and process. So before we turn it over to President De La Torre to provide some opening remarks, we're going to begin with land acknowledgement. So Roberto, you go to the next slide. So, and you can see it on your screen. We stand upon a land that carries the footsteps of millennia of Kumeyaay people. They are people whose traditional lifeways intertwine with the worldview of earth and sky, in a community of living beings. This land is part of a relationship that has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced the Kumeyaay people to the present day. It is part of a worldview founded in the harmony of the cycles of the sky and balance in the forces of life. For the Kumeyaay, red and black represent the balance of those forces that provide for harmony within our bodies as well as the world around us. As students, faculty, staff, and alumni of San Diego State University, we acknowledge this legacy from the Kumeyaay. We promote this balance in life as we pursue our goals of knowledge and understanding. We find inspiration in the Kumeyaay spirit, to open our minds and hearts. It is the legacy of the red and black. It is the land of the Kumeyaay. Yeah, my heart is good. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to President De La Torre, who's going to provide some opening remarks.
So I'd like to just start and thank you, Roberto, and everyone involved with HSI Task Force. You know, when it was interesting when our strategic planning process started, we uncovered 5 strategic priorities that emerged from thousands of voices from campus. But one priority in particular, I think, was really drew to my own heart and my own passion, and that is our vision to elevate our stature as a premier research university, a new kind of HSI. And it is really clear to me that, that moving forward, it is not simply about serving in the best capacity our Hispanic students, but also looking at how we integrate our teaching and research so that it focuses in the broadest sense possible an impact for our community and the region and the nation and the world. It's interesting because I think that when we look at what an HSI can be, I think there are certain principles that are that part and parcel of San Diego State. And that includes, you know, a commitment to empathy and courage, and also to ensure transparency in how we move forward with this particular vision. You know, I know that this is going to be a profound undertaking for the institution, meaning moving from the notion what has been a demographic reality for the campus to one aiming to really understand and provide, you know, the type of opportunities for our diverse constituents. And as I said, really beginning the robust discussion about the role of a research university moving forward with this particular designation. And to my knowledge, those robust discussions at a national level, this intersectionality, the synergy, the opportunities between a premier research institution and a teaching institution in this particular space is a unique opportunity. So I want to say, without you know, spending too much time, that this important discussion, this important town hall, is going to be very important for our future, not for the moment, but for decades to come. And it will be the imprint of, as we further develop our Imperial Valley campus, as we start looking at our Mission Valley campus as well. So again, I just want to thank you. I think this is something where we have an opportunity not only to profoundly transform the lives of our students, but also I think how our faculty, our administrators, our staff are engaged in these very, very important conversations with the idea that the outcomes will set the model for institutions to come. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, President de la Torre, for these opening remarks and for joining us today. I want to begin first by saying good afternoon to each and every one of you, and thank you all for joining us. I want to begin by introducing myself. I'm Roberto Hernandez, Chair of HSI Affairs and faculty in the Department of Chicano and Chicano Studies. And I want to begin with providing an overview of what you could expect for today's presentation on the HSI Task Force report. First, I will present a bit of the introduction and purpose of the task force, as President de la Torre has already alluded to, and grounded to an extent in our own mission, as well as our strategic priorities and the mission of the CSU. Part of the guiding questions that have informed the task force has been, what does it mean to be an HSI institution? And also, what does it entail for SDSU to embrace its HSI status? Following that, we'll move on to the 3 subcommittee reports, which both their approach as well as their findings, and then we'll go to 6 key recommendations before we end with a Q&A panel. So the task force was first convened on April 23rd, 2019. Tomorrow it'll be a year to the date. And the charge of the task force was to better inform SDSU's campus community and the strategic planning process that at the time was just getting underway about the current state of affairs for Hispanic community, but also to create a plan of action to both assist and inform SDSU in fully embracing its role as a trans-border Hispanic serving institution. In order to do that, what the task force did is it broke up into these 3 subcommittees, one on grants and external funding, representation and community engagement, climate, retention, and graduation. Ultimately, these committees worked very hard through the summer and fall to put together what is a report that was finally ratified on February 28th of this year, and which we are presenting to you now. So as you're all familiar with, I won't go over our 5 strategic priorities, but suffice to say that in our prior strategic plan, HSI was nowhere to be found. And in this current 5 strategic priorities, although we have the most explicit one being the notion of becoming a premier public research university, a new kind of HSI, in many ways, arguably, embracing our HSI status is a principle that can be found in all 5 of our strategic priorities. So what does it mean to be a Hispanic serving institution? Federal guidelines in particular state that for an institution to be designated as HSI, it must be an eligible institution. It must be one whose enrollment of undergraduate students is at least 25%. But that's not all. Something that oftentimes is absent from the conversation is that HSI designation also entails having a variable percentage of low-income Pell eligible students on par with other comparable 4 institutions, and that our per student expenditures be lower than the median for those same comparable institutions. So an emphasis in HSI is that we support not only Hispanic students, but also low-income students. In terms of SDSU, our own fall 2019 enrollment placed us at 30.7% Hispanic students, and we did fall above the 37% threshold for Pell Grant eligible student enrollment. In practice, what has meant? HSI has meant simply eligibility to grants, right? The ability to apply to specific set-aside grants that we'll talk about a bit further when we get to the grant and external funding subcommittee. But ultimately, this has also meant that there has been limited beneficiaries, in particular, often PIs in a few fields that really stand out as some of the ones that usually apply to these grants. But there's also been a lack of distribution of benefit to Hispanic students, faculty, staff, or surrounding communities. Nor has this idea of being a Hispanic serving institution been reflected in campus culture. So what does it mean for SDSU to embrace its HSI status? For this, we turn to the work of Nia Garcia, who herself has been a scholar of HSI institutions and who has come up with an important typology that has informed a lot of the work of our committee in particular, but also a lot of the most forward thinking in with all things HSI. And for Garcia, she comes up with this typology that points to a distinction between 4 types of model. So on the one hand, you have Latinx enrolling institutions, which are characterized by simply meeting the minimum requirement of 25% Latinx students, but not necessarily producing equitable number of legitimized outcomes, nor having an organizational culture that supports Hispanic students on campus. Secondly, she points to Latinx producing institutions, which are institutions that enroll the minimum 25% and produce a significant, although not always equitable, number of outcomes for Latinx students, despite a lack of culture for supporting said students. Her third category, Latinx enhancing, points to institutions that have that 25% enrollment and enact a culture that enhances the educational experiences of Latinx students, but does not necessarily produce the equitable outcomes that we would like to see. And lastly, the fourth category, which she, in her typology, uses the language of Latinx serving, is Hispanic serving institutions that both enroll the minimum 25% as well as the threshold of low-income students, and at the same time also produce an equitable number of legitimized outcomes and enacts a culture that is educationally enhancing and welcoming to not only Hispanic students, but all students. So using this typology, the task force determined that SDSU could currently best be understood as perhaps a Latinx producing institution. However, we are well positioned to becoming a truly Latinx serving institution. And that is in many ways the goal and the plan of action that this task force and this report looks to set out. Moving to the specific subcommittees. The first committee was a committee on representation and community engagement. And what this subcommittee did is it conducted a survey of 117 faculty and staff on SDSU's current practices for serving our Latinx faculty and staff community and student community. And this committee further conducted individual interviews with 17 faculty members and staff. Part of the findings of this subcommittee, it noted that there was a sense of a lack of support for and information on Latinx issues, and ultimately this meant were pointed towards the need to support centralizing Latinx community initiatives and efforts. Secondly, the subcommittee found that there was an underrepresentation and overworking of Latinx faculty and staff, and therefore the need for more targeted outreach and inreach. Some of the findings included things such as the need for more tenure-track faculty, the possibility of adding fluency of Spanish as a preferred requirement, and acknowledging the cultural tax or service taxation with perhaps some increased workload to account for said service. Its third finding was that there is definitely a need for more attention to climate efforts in order to better retain both faculty and staff, right? That we need to be able to foster a welcoming and supportive environment for our students, our faculty and staff, as well as connect both our faculty and staff to HSI related grant information. And as you will see, there's certain findings that definitely overlap across the different subcommittees. This first subcommittee further found that it was important to provide support and information to the Latinx ERGs and regarding access to different forms of information that could better improve, their climate and their presence on our campus. Lastly, one of the findings of this committee was that there has been a sense of treating the Imperial Valley campus as a second-class campus, and that we need to more fully integrate in collaboration connection between our Mesa campus as well as the Imperial Valley campus, as well as invest in our faculty and staff and students at that campus. Moving on to the second subcommittee, which was on climate retention and graduation. What this subcommittee did is it conducted an intensive review of all institutional data from faculty affairs, enrollment service, including also HARRY and analytic studies and institutional research data. And secondly, we conducted a number of focus groups called cafecitos, or small coffee roundtables, if you will, in which we discussed questions of campus climate with Chicano and Chicano and Latinx faculty and staff members, and then separate groups also with students. Lastly, committee member myself, I also visited the Imperial Valley campus during the time of the strategic planning, and took the opportunity to meet with both faculty and senior leadership at the SDSU Imperial Valley campus regarding their engagement with HSI. Moving on to the findings of this subcommittee, again, we noted that there was a serious cultural taxation or expectations that were often placed on Latinx faculty members, in particular, expectations to be part of the diversity team, right? And not enough protection from service work, especially for junior faculty. This often meant, has translated to longer time to promotion, both to associate as well as full. We also noted on the faculty end that the lack of recognition for other publication languages is not being recognized as having the same value in Spanish in particular, given that many of our faculty members publish both, in multiple languages, and Spanish included. Lastly, the subcommittee recognized that there's need for better recruitment, retention, mentorship, and promotion pipeline to support our junior faculty in particular. The third subcommittee on grants and external funding itself conducted an in-depth review and analysis of the SDSU Research Foundation data to see how many faculty have participated in HSI set-aside competitions since 2015. In particular, it sought to identify the percentages in which SDSU grant writers opted for applying to HSI grant set-asides versus non-HSI grants. This committee importantly found that SDSU should provide more grant-getting training, specifically exploring strategies and tactics to leverage our HSI identities. One of the important findings of this committee was that faculty themselves are not applying to all set-aside opportunities, even though for which our campus is eligible, even though when we do apply to set grants, we have a higher percentage of actually benefiting and being successful in such opportunities. Therefore, SDSU should explore the potential value of dedicated expert staff for diversity initiatives, enhancing faculty participation in HSI competitions. We should also look to these set-aside competitions given our higher rates rather than as opposed to in non-set-aside grant opportunities. And lastly, more attention is needed to communicate to faculty members how they might benefit from applying to these set-aside grants. Taken together, the work of these various subcommittees, which I should emphasize is not in any way exhaustive, nevertheless was synthesized into what we will move on to now, which is a set of 6 key recommendations. And again, these are not the entirety of the recommendations. Those you can find in the report that is available at the Diversity and Innovation website, which I'll display shortly. So moving on to the first key recommendation, we found that there's a need to clearly communicate our HSI identity, right? This means that SDSU should be able to translate the work of not just the report into today's town hall, but also be better able to communicate what it means to be an HSI across campus. Towards this end, we have completed this report. We are having this town hall today. I myself am now serving as chair of HSI Affairs in line with one of the recommendations here. And we have developed professional learning seminars through the professors of equity and now in this role that are being rolled out and will be presented monthly across campus. I have done 2 initial presentations and will continue with more of this as the fall comes along. Lastly, we can see that HSI has now been integrated throughout our strategic plan, as I mentioned earlier. However, one last point that is worth mentioning is that although the task force was initially created as an ad hoc task force for the purpose of creating this report, there was a sense on the part of the task force itself that the work of HSI is in the report is not exhaustive and that is necessary to have the task force continue meeting as a form of advisory group to the chair of HSI Affairs. And this will again continue in the fall and the time thereafter. The second key recommendation, again synthesized from the findings of the various groups, was the need for expanded support for our ERGs. The subcommittees found that we need more support in advancing the recruitment, retention, and climate for all Chicano, Latina, Latinx faculty and staff, as well as students. But we need to also pay attention to our faculty and staff and retention there as well. Currently, there are 2 active ERGs that are geared towards the Latinx population. These ERGs have already been coordinating various activities that have increased their visibility throughout the fall, this last fall and spring, some of which included the Dia de Muertos event, a vigil following the El Paso shooting, as well as a SDSU Latina Network luncheon. The third key recommendation is the need for professional learning on Latinx issues. The committees collectively found that SDSU should require extensive ongoing professional learning opportunities for students, faculty, and staff on pressing Chicano and Latinx issues, and as well as our institution's identity as a Hispanic serving institution. So these trainings should be embedded into the onboarding of all new members of our campus community, and faculty should ideally be intentionally oriented towards our embracing our HSI status and what it might mean for our teaching and research activity. Again, towards these ends, we have developed the professional learning seminars that will be presented not only monthly, but our hope is to have that presented at new faculty orientations as well. For students, we hope to in the fall develop a online version that will also be available. And myself as chair of HSI Affairs, I will also make myself available for consultative appointments, which I have begun to do with different departments, both in the context of faculty hires, but also faculty and departments, units that have already began reaching out to better acquaint themselves with what it means to be HSI and how does that translate to their respective work. Lastly, we will also be developing a professional learning seminar on integrating HSI framing into grant proposals. And this is something that I'll be doing jointly with John Crockett of the Research Affairs, which was also a member of our task force. The following, recommendation, the next recommendation was the need for enhanced recruitment retention of efforts for Latinx faculty and staff. Here, the subcommittee and the committee as a whole noted that SDSU should make better efforts to recruit and retain Latinx faculty and staff, with special attention given to the possibility of interdisciplinary cluster hires that support on initiatives such as building on inclusive excellence, particularly around Latinx populations. Faculty pool proportionality should also be considered in hiring committees, and the university should actively advertise all staff positions to diverse candidates. Implicit bias trainings should be a requirement for all members of hiring committees, and we have began implementing some of this with implicit bias in hiring trainings that were rolled out during the fall 2019 and that have been strongly recommended for all hiring committees. I, as chair of HSI Affairs, will also be working closely with the professors of equity on updating the appropriate PLSs to include relevant HSI information. The next key recommendation was for our campus to better leverage our HSI research funds and our eligibility. We should be able to leverage our accessible resources that are already available, as well as what HSI designation provides in terms of access to more resources from federally funded programs. But it's also important to recognize the need that there's still many untapped opportunities for research and programmatic funding that we have not fully taken advantage of. Towards that end, SDSU should focus on developing the development and hosting of a curated library of boilerplate text or framing that to support faculty efforts in their pursuit of external funding. Already we have began the access collaboration with other campuses to develop best practices for our research offices in terms of research active HSIs. We're also working on developing a database and proposal text and narratives to facilitate faculty grant applications. Lastly, this also means developing a PLS to assist faculty through the HSI set-aside processes. Our sixth key recommendation was that we engage in leadership in Mesoamerican, transborder, Chicano, and Latinx and Indigenous studies. San Diego State should embrace its location as a transborder HSI institution and become a leader in these related research areas according to respective disciplines. SDSU should support programs and faculty already engaged in doing research in this area. However, to be systematically meaningful, we must also engage the local indigenous communities and include cluster hires across multiple colleges and fields. This means drawing on local expertise, considering the possibility of high-profile hires in these respective fields, and supporting and expanding the relevant library collections. Lastly, I want to turn to a bit of a plan of action. So you've seen already some of the key recommendations, some of the actions that have been taken. And here I just include a few more points that we will also be undertaking as a result of this HSI task force and its report, and that is to do a better job of engaging alumni and community partners, to work closely, especially under the current conditions where some of our work has shifted with our newly hired director of the Latinx Resource Center, Nia Sanchez Garcia, on yield and retention efforts, to interface with the San Diego Chicano Latino Concilio for Higher Education, which has been a longstanding body in San Diego that has attended to issues of higher education across the various both community college as well as universities and K through 12. Among their activities, there is a Latino Education Summit they hold each year, in which already we as the SU have had the opportunity to engage directly with other HSI campuses in our area so that we could coordinate our efforts, especially when it's a community college to for your university pipeline. And then lastly, continue working towards earning our Excelencia Seal of Excellence. I will go ahead and conclude there, and we will now turn towards a Q&A with myself as Chair of HSI Affairs, but we also have joining us today Nicole Lyle, who's from the Diversity and Innovation Officer, as well as Brittany Santos Duriay, the Chief of Staff of the Office of the President. So please feel free. Yes.
And I'd also like to add that John Crockett was also able to make it, so he is here as well.
Oh, okay, great. So John's joined us as well. So please enter your questions through the Q&A option that you see below, and the panelists here will addressing all the questions that we receive. I see there's 3 questions. However, I'm having difficulty accessing it. Do I need to stop sharing to be able to access the Q&A panel?
I can read the questions out and then the panelists can respond if that's fine with you, Roberto.
Yeah, that works.
So the first question says, colleges and departments should be required to articulate how they intend to promote SDSU's HSI status in their diversity plans. Has there been any talk about this?
Well, I'll speak to this a bit, and I know that currently, speaking on behalf of Cal, that we've been undergoing the process of writing our diversity plan, and we have made it a point to, follow the lead of the strategic plan that does raise this issue of embracing HSI. So I know Cal has taken some initiative towards that end. I can't really speak to other colleges, as I'm not in any other college.
And I can say that I think a lot of the teams that have been engaged in the diversity planning process have been attentive to this. So I do see this as something that people are doing as part of their own college's committee. Once they've been able to look at their data and identify groups that are experiencing disproportionate impact, invariably, we oftentimes find that our minoritized communities are among those groups. And so this is something that I think people are talking about. It hasn't been something that we have done formally. It's been something that has more so come up informally as part of the process. So the next question said, will copies of the slides be made available for all attendees? That's a technical question that we can respond to. The recording of this will be, and the slides, of course, are embedded within the recording. The next question is, will we disaggregate data specifically for the Imperial Valley campus? So Roberto, you were part of that task force. You might be able to talk about how that survey data, you and Nicole could probably talk about how that was collected separately.
Yes, currently there is data that has been disaggregated for Imperial Valley. So each subcommittee made it a point to look at both the main campus as well as the Imperial Valley campus on their own. And then we've kind of combined some of that data for certain purposes, but in other instances, we have maintained it as separate data. It's important to note, Tristan, that the Imperial Valley campus is well over 90% Hispanic, and is in fact also an HSI campus in its own right. Although there's also certain technicalities around applications to HSI set-asides that perhaps John or others can speak to in terms of some grants we apply for SDSU as a whole, whereas other grants Imperial Valley could apply to them directly.
Yeah, and happy, Roberto, just to follow on that, you have it exactly right. And I think as the leadership grows out there in the Imperial Valley, we're seeing great enthusiasm to enhance their own research enterprises, especially as it serves their students with topics and projects that are relevant to their campus and that region. I mean, one specific example is just our efforts to expand their capacity to do nursing training through telemedicine. It's both timely and a really important effort. But I think that's just one example of the opportunities that are going to continue to grow there at that campus.
So the next question is, do you have a compilation of projects, programs that are currently working on Latinx, transborder, and other issues? I'm especially wondering about intersectional programs and projects that may not have been included in your preliminary research. Roberto, you should probably respond to this because I know that this is something you've been looking into.
Yes, one of the things we found was that in many ways, there are different types of efforts that have been very specific, say, to colleges, departments. There's a number of HSI grants that individual PIs across campus have been successful in obtaining. However, there hadn't really been one concise clearinghouse for, let's say, all HSI efforts. So we're trying to compile that so that that's all readily available in one specific website. I believe we'll probably be including some of this in the newly developed HSI Affairs website that you see listed on your screen now. But just to cite a few examples in education, there's currently a successful HSI grant called Deber, which is a training program for effective community college teaching. There's a number of efforts being done through the new Latinx Resource Center, for example, that also tie into the HSI work. And other specific projects such as Access that I referred to, which will be an ongoing or continuing collaboration with other comparable HSIs that are also research active, and a number of specific initiatives within the rubric of this Access effort as well, just to name a few.
And Roberto, if I can just add, I see that question was asked by Nola. I would love to sit down with people who are thinking about and talking about these types of things. She used the word intersectional in her question, and that may be specific, or it may refer to multidisciplinary efforts on campus. I can tell you from my experience that SDSU is at its best in these programs when multiple departments, multiple colleges are engaged in looking at how to advance the success of all of our students. And sometimes that requires an initial conversation and a few additional conversations. So I can certainly commit to following up with Nola and clarifying what she thinks is possible.
Yeah, and I apologize, I can't really see the questions from my current view since I have the share screen. But I should note that one of the specific major points within the professional learning seminar on HSIs is also to understand that this notion of Hispanic serving community also creates a kind of false sense of a monolithic Hispanic community. But it is very important. One of the important tasks I've kind of set out to do in these professional learning seminars is precisely to dispel this idea of the Hispanic community as a monolithic community, to point precisely to both the racial diversity, the gender diversity, the class diversity that exists within this name, if you will, of Hispanic community, right? To better speak precisely to the intersectional aspects that compose what we think of as a Hispanic community.
The next question comes from Teresa, and it is, has SDSU accepted the report's recommendations such that they will become part of the institutional's policy and practice? Brittany, I think you might be able to respond to that.
Yes, I mean, so some of the recommendations were able to be implemented as the group was going forward, and a number of them were about simply bringing together resources, coordinating resources, elevating the way that we were talking about them, and ensuring that our identity as an HSI was integrated into the strategic plan. So for those pieces, absolutely, because they were process oriented as the university came together to deliberate around the strategic planning process, or they were necessary work that was either coming out of the newly formed Division of Diversity and Innovation or necessary for the work of the committee to go deep into the details to inform future recommendations. For the more forward-looking recommendations in the report, practices around our research infrastructure, practices around supports for our students, many of them align with the strategic plan itself. So that process is that the strategic plan has been delivered to associated students, the draft, as well as delivered to the Senate. They're currently reviewing. They'll provide any additional comment to our office in a few weeks. And then that plan will be formally accepted in May. And that is the process for those pieces for the HSI strategic planning priority, for those recommendations that intersect with the strategic planning priority, which was the plan from the beginning, that these two things would come together at the end. And so I would say that for the rest of the recommendations in this final report, they may be impacted by any final changes to the strategic plan, and so it will be formally accepted in May alongside the strategic plan.
Thank you. The next question comes from Roberto Ochoa. How will SDSU use HSI be engaged with the K-12 school communities in San Diego County to raise A through G requirements from 30% to 50%?
Well, one of the ways that we look forward to continuing this work, as I mentioned, this task force was by no means exhaustive, but rather to have a person in place as well as a broader ongoing task force committee to continue interfacing, in particular with not just other community colleges and four-year institutions, but also with K through 12. So in particular, although not solely with the Concilio, the Chicano Latino Concilio on Higher Education, we plan to continue meeting regularly on some of these questions to see how we could better integrate our efforts.
And I'd also add that within the strategic plan, there's a very specific call out to building these kinds of partnerships and relationships. The draft plan has a key activity that says by fall of 2023, we'll develop a university infrastructure that fosters and sustains regional partnerships with K-12 schools, community colleges, educational organizations, and industry around the goal of promoting college readiness and a college-going culture. So I think this is something that, again, because there was cross-pollination between this committee and the strategic planning committee, many of the elements are embedded within the draft report that's been submitted to the University Senate and the AS for their review and comment. So the next question says, what are steps in honoring the Spanish language that Latinx students bring? How can we treat it as an asset within our institution? Would any of the panelists like to address that?
I think there's a number of ways, and every panelist can address it at a different point in a student's journey into and out of San Diego State University. The first one that comes to mind is that this is part of the recommendations for our new comprehensive admissions policy. It's in a recognition, even prior to students arriving at San Diego State, that this is value added by literacy in any language, but for our community as well. The biliteracy seal that California has embraced around Spanish and other languages, that this is an asset and it should be weighted as such. So that is part of the comprehensive admissions proposal that has already, that has also been discussed at Senate, and that we are looking forward to continuing to move forward with that group and implement. Roberto and others, and if Christina Alfaro is on the call, there is a number of other ways to treat this as an asset as part of the student experience while they're here at San Diego State.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly that this also looks different in different, according to different departments and different types of initiatives. In Chicano and Chicano Studies, for example, we oftentimes have, students who also engage, turn in work in Spanish, research essays in Spanish, and promoting what are already their existing capacities and capabilities towards orienting it towards a more elaborate academic Spanish, if you will.
All right, let's go to the next question. This question comes from Teresa Ramirez Velasquez, and it says, are there plans for long-term appointment of the HSI chair as a full-time position with a budget and staff? And I think that I can respond to that and just say that establishing the position was the first step in what would be a longer-term process and series of the decisions that would need to take place. So Christina Alfaro served as the first chair of HSI Affairs. And Roberto Hernandez has taken over that mantle, given her move into the interim role of AVP for Global Affairs. And so we will continue to assess as we move forward with the goal of making sure that the strategies that we've identified both within this report and within the strategic plan are aligned with whatever resources that are available. So I don't have an immediate answer to that question, except to say that we'll continue to monitor with the goal of making sure that this role continues to be valued and elevated within our institution. The next question comes from Christian Aquino Sterling, and it says, greetings. Hispanic is not a homogeneous identity category. Moreover, there are known tensions between Hispanic enclaves. As an Afro-Caribbean person, I have personally experienced many moments of exclusion for our own Hispanic Chicano community. How does the approach at continuing to develop SDSU as an inclusive HSI institution account for this disparities of Hispanic experiences? Could professional development also help us understand the role of Afro-Latinx, Indigenous Latinx, etc., beyond Chicanas and white Latinx perspectives at SDSU?
Yeah, I would say yes, definitely. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, one of my personal touches, if you will, in the PLSs is precisely to speak to this heterogeneity within the community, that it's important, not just in terms of acknowledging the diversity within the quote unquote Hispanic community, but also the different set of challenges that each subsector, if you will, of that community faces, right? So there's different issues that arise for Indigenous Latino students. There's different issues that arise for Afro-Latinx students, faculty, staff, and so on. So we definitely are, you could say, from our starting point is precisely to try to acknowledge that difference, recognize that diversity, and do away with this homogenizing of this identity.
Thank you, Roberto. This next question comes from Nia Sanchez Garcia, and she says, thank you for the work through the HSI committee and this report. Her question is, in addition to intersectionality of Latinx identities, is there also a focus on those communities most marginalized within the Latinx community? Specifically, I'm thinking about Central American Afro, Latinx, and undocumented students. Very similar to the first question, but bringing in kind of also a thought about our undocumented students as well. So if you could respond to that.
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, working alongside Cynthia Torres, for example, we definitely plan to you know, be attentive to those particular areas that necessitate different type of attention, different types of resources, and again, to the best of our ability, given the broader question of available resources on campus, especially as we enter this new unknown terrain in the coming months and possible semesters. But yes, definitely.
Thank you. The next question says, and it comes from an anonymous attendee, one of the recommendations states that SDSU should work towards becoming a leader in Mesoamerican studies, transborder studies, and Chicano Latinx studies. How are other identities within the diaspora included, including Afro-Latinx communities?
So again, this is the way I would respond to this question is that even within the respective fields, that they themselves are not monolithic, right? So speaking, I'll put on my Chicano Studies hat for a moment and just say that part of the work that we do that is not only about, say, Chicano populations, but rather thinking about historical processes of slavery, thinking about historical processes of colonialism, thinking about the ways in which processes of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia helped shape and inform the modern colonial world over the last 500 years. So the fact that we are named Chicano Studies does not mean we only look at certain populations. Quite the contrary. I would say the impetus of most ethnic studies departments, as one example, is to think about historical processes rather than just populations, and that necessitates these broader intersectional approaches if one is to do ethnic studies properly.
And then this question comes from Diana Scaramucci, and it says, good afternoon. Thank you for hosting this town hall. I'm from the Air Force ROTC Aerospace Studies Department. Hopefully this is an appropriate question to bring up and could be useful for the task force. Every year from our headquarters, we receive additional scholarship funds, type 2 full in-state rate for tuition only because of SDSU's identity as an HSI university. This year, we garnered 3 additional scholarships because of the HSI efforts here. Thank you. The students in our program who accept these scholarship funds ultimately commission into the Air Force to serve as graduates from SDSU. So I can begin by responding to that because we have similar partnerships also that we've established very recently with the Coast Guard. So I would say that these are wonderful programs that are out there that do provide unique scholarship opportunities for our students, and also provide them with accelerated access into the ranks within our military service. And that these partnerships are very core to the work that we do as part of our the Division of Diversity and Innovation, in partnership with our Veterans Center and the great work that Todd and Holly are doing there. And so, yes, it's something that we are aware of. We want to continue to foster these partnerships because they provide great opportunities, again, for our students, but also it's a way that we're leveraging this identity and opportunities that come with being an HSI. And John, I don't know if you want to speak to that from more of the research perspective in terms of how we can continue to leverage those unique opportunities as an HSI.
Well, I think this is just a really important, specific example of the scale of attention that is on SDSU as an HSI, and having all of these other characteristics and features at the same time. I had talked with Roberto yesterday, I don't know if it came up, but one of the things that we were working to do before the quarantine was to align highly active research institutions that are also Hispanic serving institutions to develop these, like the ROTC and other opportunities, because of the importance of those special characteristics and because of the national attention that is on us and those other institutions as being a critical component of research, education, workforce development. And so I think all I would do is suggest that if you are interested in exploring how to honor and authentically elevate our HSI identity, come to Roberto, come to Luke, come to our office in Graduate and Research Affairs, and let's talk about how to do it, because there really is so much attention and interest in providing support to our institution and to our students, that it can really crop up in sort of unexpected but kind of delightful ways. I think that's where I'd probably leave that.
And with that, I think that we are near the end of our time. Roberto, if you want to just close this out, since to be respectful of people's time.
Yes, definitely. So before we formally close out, I do want to, first of all, point out the autocorrect error on the top of this should be HSI Task Force. It's been a constant battle against autocorrect, but I want to acknowledge all the members of the task force who worked at different moments of time throughout the last year on the various components that went into producing this report, both from the research, the consultation, deliberations, as well as data and report preparation. And with that, lastly, just end by saying, Ehan, gracias, thank you, Glaso Kamati, obrigado. Thank you, each and every one of you, for joining us. My email is there. As John mentioned, you could reach out to myself or others in the task force for these further questions. Thank you.